personality. It was a real relationship. And so what happened is ISKCON grew so fast, so explosively, that the time came within a few years that, well over 90%, maybe like 95% or more of all the devotees in ISKCON did not know Prabhupada personally. Probably had never had a personal conversation with him. And Prabhupada had never really met them. I mean, almost, and so when you don't know someone like that, because the movement grows so quickly and it's going all around the world, and so you get this mythologizing of Prabhupada. And by mythologizing, I don't mean thinking he's a pure devotee is a myth. He is a pure devotee. Krishna did send him to this world to save us, but he's a real person. And he's a real person who not only respected our individuality, he fought for it. Because if you look at it, you can find all this in the biographies and the letters. This was a very common theme in the early days. That because Prabhupada was the Acharya, the founder Acharya, was a pure devotee, he exercised sort of absolute authority, because that's the nature of charismatic leadership, which is the only way you get religion started historically. And so therefore, we were young, and so if we were temple presidents or this or that, we were like these little sort of child dictators. I mean, if you're old enough, you remember what ISKCON was like back, temple presidents and leaders, and it was kind of like this tragico-comical tyranny. It's like immature young people imitating the great guru. And so Prabhupada frequently had to intervene and write these very strong, admonishing letters to leaders in ISKCON saying, sort of, leave the young devotees alone. Let them be themselves. Let them do the service they want to do. So Prabhupada would, just like any good loving mother or father, you step in and don't allow an older child to bully a younger child. And so Prabhupada insisted on this freedom. I mean, obviously, you can take anything to an absurd extreme. It can't be chaos and anarchy. But within reasonable boundaries, Prabhupada demanded and fought for the freedom and the individuality of his disciples. He had individual relationships with different disciples. He respected and fought for their right to serve him and serve Krishna according to their own natures. You didn't have this steep hierarchy in ISKCON. I mean, even with Prabhupada, again, the devotees knew he's a pure devotee. He's a divine being. He's the founder of Acharya. But still, it was personal. It was real. It was a real personal relationship. It was loving. You can see pictures of Mukunda's wife, Janaki, in the airport, literally like stealing Prabhupada's plane ticket and like sort of taunting him, like, I won't give it back, you got to stay here with us. Prabhupada just laughing. Look at the relationship between Prabhupada and his spiritual daughters. They would joke publicly, they would joke, and they would play together, and it was just a loving father with his beloved daughters. And so that's the ISKCON I want to bring back. Because I believe that around 1970, if you read Prabhupada's biography, things really changed, and not necessarily in a good way. It started with, if you read, this is all in the Lamrita, you can read the details, where Prabhupada, some of Prabhupada's disciples, those four devotees became sannyasis, somehow or other become involved with the Gaudiya Math, and were sort of making plans to almost usurp Prabhupada's authority. And Prabhupada was kind of heartbroken by this, and he went back to India, sort of get the home court advantage. He felt that for his own security and to have really, be sure that he could govern ISKCON, he went back to India, wherever he had the home court advantage. And it's not that the devotees were all against him. Everyone was giving their life for Prabhupada, but he remembered that there had been an assassination attempt against his guru. So Prabhupada did go back to India, and of course it was Krishna's plan. He didn't want to go back. This is in Prabhupada's biography, the Lamrita, where he was practically in tears when he went in front of the deities in Los Angeles, New Dwarka, to say goodbye. And he had really wanted to form his world headquarters in Los Angeles. It was an American-based movement. And he said to Krishna, why are you taking me away? He didn't want to go back to India because India is where he had been simply frustrated, and there was nothing but disappointment. Before he left India, he tried to establish his movement there, and no one was interested. He said they only wanted to be Western. So came to America, got all these hundreds and thousands of followers. When he went back to India in 1970, he went back as a conquering hero. He was like the biggest celebrity in the country. And everywhere he went, there were thousands and tens of thousands of people that came to hear him. And of course, the rest is history. So that happened. You know, Krishna kind of the ISKCON's center of gravity shifted to India, and I remember that. There was no internet there. There was no internet. We couldn't even afford telephones. We couldn't even make long-distance domestic calls back then. So we would get letters, handwritten letters, you know, from Prabhupada's secretary in India. And what happened was, devotees started visiting India, and so all these Indian customs, some good, a lot of superstition, a lot of rituals that Prabhupada never wanted introduced, became introduced in ISKCON. And so it really began then. I mean, it took years, but the Indianization of ISKCON, not the Vedicizing, the Indianization of ISKCON, complete with endless rituals that Prabhupada didn't want, superstitions that Prabhupada never believed in. Like, for example, there's this widespread superstition that when you chant Gayatri Mantra, you cover your hand so that different beings don't steal all of your spiritual credit, which is, I mean, obviously some celestial being, millions, you know, light years away, they can steal your credit, but he can't go through a thin cloth. So just a thin cloth will do it. You know, these beings can travel across the universe, but they can't get through cotton. That's the secret. It's like they're kryptonite. So, you know, you see pictures of Prabhupada boldly chanting Gayatri Mantra with his hand almost like brazenly exposed. Or, for example, these superstitions, if you go to Vrindavan, you can't wear shoes, you got to take your feet off and basically, you know, permanently damage your feet and get all kinds of diseases. But you see Prabhupada walk around in shoes all the time. Or you can't worship the deity with sewn clothing because everyone knows that needle and thread are, you know, terribly contaminating for reasons yet to be discovered. And so you have these temples where people go on the altar and they can't wear stitched clothing, they have to, you know. But Prabhupada, there's all these pictures of Prabhupada with, you know, sewn clothing, installing deities, Radha Krishna deities. So these are just a few examples. We go on and on of how ISKCON became sort of overcome by Indian superstition and meaningless rituals. And everything from the recipes for food, the way the offerings were cooked, the way the music was played, everything had to be Indianized. And at the same time this was happening, I mean, it started in 1970. It took, you know, years and years to really get to the unbelievable places it's come now. But at the same time, something else was happening. Prabhupada said, you have to distribute my books. Prabhupada was translating, commenting on sacred texts, which are just the foundation of our spiritual movement. If you study, for example, the history of early Christianity, and all the councils of Nicaea and Trent and here and there, all these battles over doctrine. And it split. I mean, if you look at it split the Christian world into Protestants and Catholics. Even before that, it split them into Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity. I mean, and there were all kinds of heresies, and often, actually, the bad guys won. But anyway, so it was just a big, and you know, what did Jesus really teach? And even if we agree that Jesus spoke these words, what does it mean? And even if you look at the New Testament, if you actually, from a scholarly perspective, if you study the formation of the Christian canon, which wasn't formalized until actually over 300 years after Jesus. I mean, the earliest evidence we have that, because there were all these books floating around, there were all kinds of Christianities. And then it didn't get standardized until the Emperor Constantine adopted Christianity and just decided, we just want one version of this. So he just kind of killed everything else. And anyway, so you don't really get the formal canon, which we call the New Testament, until 300 years later, and all kinds of things have happened and story. That's a whole other story. So Prabhupada wrote his books. He really wanted his books to be printed in his lifetime and distributed. Unless we sold his books, you couldn't keep them in print because, you know, we didn't have any benefactors. And so, but then Prabhupada kind of unleashed this energy, which I'm sure he didn't know he was unleashing, this book distribution thing where it was just kind of like we bulldozed American society. and developed this terrible reputation of going to airports, and it's just like just seeing people as walking donations, and situations where, for example, we know that in these airports, the majority of books that were distributed were actually thrown away. And in the various airports like Los Angeles, there were airport workers who go around, take all these hundreds and thousands of Bhagavatams and so on out of the garbage, sell them back to the devotees, $1 a book. The devotees would buy them. So, but with that, not only, two things happened. The relationship between devotees and the public deteriorated, because rather than fitting in and really, having this mutual empathy and being part of what the scene, what's going on, we just, no one appreciated it. I mean, people that say liberal or New Age people or yoga people or intellectuals, they thought our these brutal sales techniques were just like, oh my God, this is like the last thing in the world that we call spiritual. So that relationship was broken, and is now to some extent recuperated through all involvement in the yoga world. And then also the relationship between devotees, because it was kind of like a militarizing of ISKCON. I mean, military discipline, and we got to get it was like efficiency was everything. And if you look at the sociology of military societies, because there is a specific type of psychology and sociology you find in militant or militarized societies, the role of women is seriously affected. Women have, on average, this is science, don't kill the messenger, women have, on average, 50% of the upper body strength, and your upper body is what you fight with. And so there are great women warriors in history, but not trillions of them. And so in a warrior society, the value of women is forgotten. And they're relegated to this sort of almost like ornamental role. And even ISKCON, even we couldn't do that. We couldn't even make them ornaments because they were Maya. So you have to be able to laugh sometimes. I mean,
it's not. Yeah.
No, I mean people that had experience, but I think we all know that was crazy and that was abusive. But at the same time, we have to move on. So, and this was happening. This sort of these dramatic sociological changes in ISKCON, and also in military societies, you have like this strict authority structure, and so the relationships even between men changed. Because I'm in charge and you're not, and the role of women changed, even though they were actually doing half the service. I mean, even like going out and selling the books, they were actually doing half of it at least. At least. And at the same time this was going on in the West, the movement was becoming Indianized. And so it was like this perfect storm to make the Hare Krishna movement a disaster in the Western world. And then a third element, if we want to be honest, is that this 10-year bubble burst. The 10-year bubble I'm referring to is roughly from 1966 to 1976, roughly, in which Americans and Westerners and Europeans just went I don't know, gaga over Eastern mysticism. The Beatles went to Rishikesh in India, and Jimi Hendrix put a picture of Vishnu with his own face, unfortunately, on the cover of one of his albums. And, everyone was into it. Donovan and the Rolling Stones and this group and the Grateful Dead. Everyone wanted to somehow be involved in this. And so it was a big fad. I mean, gurus were celebrities. Guru Maharaji, no comment, filled up the Astrodome. He actually had this big event in the Astrodome in Houston. Those days are long, long, long gone. And so 1970, approximately 76, you can even look at the statistics. We can actually chart, because records are kept of how many devotees Prabhupada initiated. And if you look at the number of new devotees being initiated in the Western world, it grows precipitously, explosive growth in the mid-70s, and then around 74, 75 it starts to taper off, and then it plateaus, and then by 76 it's starting to slightly decline, which exactly corresponds with American cultural history and Western European cultural history, where around that time the Vietnam War ended, and the hippies and radicals were getting older, they were getting married, they needed real jobs, and that was it. and Indian mysticism was out of fashion. So the general enthusiasm for Indian mysticism is over. ISKCON is locked into this militant book distribution regime, which damages relationships between men and men, between men and women, and between us and the public. Prabhupada, the movement's grown so much, new devotees never really know Prabhupada anymore. He becomes this iconic, almost mythic figure. New devotees no longer really meet Prabhupada or even talk to him. ISKCON's center shifts to India, and you get this naive, omnivorous adaptation of everything Indian. And the movement basically, it's people stop joining utopian communities. People stop joining communes. That's out of fashion. And at the same time, around that time, America changes its immigration laws. America changes its immigration laws because they had this, for forever, they had these immigration laws that favored white Europeans because they're the ones that started the country. And because the civil rights movement, sort of one of the consequences of the civil rights movement was that people started saying the immigration laws are racist. And people from non-white countries should also be able to come to this country. And so one of the results of that was that thousands of Indians started flooding into America. When I joined the Hare Krishna movement, there were you might occasionally, at some point in your life, meet a Hindu living in America. It wasn't like there were 3 million like nowadays, including the head of Microsoft and the former governor of South Carolina and the former governor of Louisiana. It was very different. And so Indians start flooding in. People stop joining utopian movements and spiritual movements. People lose interest in Indian mysticism. The remnant of it is just kind of like this Americanized athletic yoga. And our temple economies were based on making new devotees all the time, because some devotees after a few years did really crazy things like getting married and even having children. I'm kidding. That's a joke. But that was the attitude. That was the attitude then. And so when people stopped joining, we couldn't replenish the ranks in the ashrams, in the temples, and therefore temple economies crashed. Temple economies crashed. And you can say, well, that's just money, but when you can't even keep the lights on in the temple, and it's winter up north and there's no heating, it makes you think. And so at the same time the temple economies were crashing, all these Indians were, immigrating into America and coming to our temples and giving donations. And so ISKCON reinvented itself practically. The temples reinvented themselves as institutions that simply minister to the Hindu diaspora. And all of Prabhupada's dreams of actually making America Krishna conscious, and he used, it was just all gone. And now you have leaders in ISKCON don't even know that Prabhupada said that. And so the real point of Krishna West, ironically, although some people think that this is some kind of radical or revolutionary thing, ultimately it's exactly the opposite. It's actually trying to get back to the golden age of ISKCON in the Western world. When the movement was actually working, when it was growing, when we had great relations with the public, when women were equal members of this movement. It's trying to get back. Is Krishna West, ironically, is very conservative. It's trying to get back to the Western Hare Krishna movement during its best period, when Prabhupada lived in America, saw his own movement as a Western movement, and was making all the adjustments necessary to make it work in America and other Western countries. So, that's trying to put it in historical context. Apart from that, when a movement goes to another country, in history, there's no historical record of a new religious or spiritual movement going to a foreign country and keeping all the external cultural features of its country of origin and actually succeeding. It just doesn't work. The only time it does work is if the new religion is brought in by armies who basically torture and kill people that don't cooperate. And so since violent coercion is not an option for us, for many reasons, and the first of which, of course, is moral, so we have to look historically at under what circumstances do people voluntarily, of their own free will, adopt a new spiritual tradition and adopt it in such numbers that it actually becomes a significant spiritual tradition or religion in that new culture. And what history teaches us is that in every case, you have to adapt to the culture you're in. The only exception being, there are two exceptions. One is violent, one is nonviolent. And that is, the nonviolent exception is, if the country of origin, the country where this tradition comes from, has significantly greater prestige than the country to which it goes. In other words, for example, when Prabhupada put me in charge of Latin America in 1974, and I traveled everywhere throughout Latin America. Actually, I never made it to Paraguay, but everywhere else. So in Central America and South America. And because I was American, and this was kind of like, and so basically in 1974 in Latin America was 1969 in America. And the idea of, Indian mysticism was really taking off. It was really hot, and I was coming from America and telling everybody in Latin America in their language, like, hey, this is what's happening now. And so, because, again, in subjective terms, in sociology, we talk about status or prestige cultures. So for Latin America, America was a prestige culture. Not in the sense that in some ultimate way it's superior. That's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about just attitudes. People's attitudes. Not what's ultimately real and important. And so in terms of people's attitudes, this was coming from America. So when something new comes from a place that has more status, people trying to cash in on that status, they accept it. And so there was intrinsic interest in what we were presenting. A lot of people actually were just interested. But also, the fact that it's coming from America worked. And Prabhupada said that. He said that's why he came to America. He came to America because he understood basic sociology. He understood that that culture, like water, flows downward. It doesn't flow upward. Culture doesn't flow from less prestigious countries to more prestigious countries. It's just not the way the world is. And so Prabhupada, so what do we do now? I mean, and so the fact that Prabhupada's movement is really kind of floundering, if you just want to be blunt and, cut through all the ISKCON 50 hyperbole, because Prabhupada's Western mission is floundering, we have to reinvent. We have to go back and see, what did Prabhupada do? How do we make this work? So that's what we're trying to do. Because if we don't make the movement work in America and in other Western countries, Prabhupada's global strategy fails. Prabhupada had a specific global strategy, which was that if we could make this work in the Western world, other countries would adapt it. In modern political, social terms, it's called soft power. Hard power being, guns, bullets, fighter jets, nuclear submarines. That's hard power. Soft power means Hollywood is soft power. Not always for good, often for evil, but Hollywood is soft power. Or for example, music. The Beatles were soft power. They spread, they weren't military, but they spread so many ideas. They had power, they had influence. And so when you can create something which culturally attracts other people, that's soft power. And so Prabhupada's whole global strategy depends on reviving his movement in the West, making it relevant, making it powerful. If we don't do that, basically it fails. And if our generation doesn't do it, any historian will tell you it's very likely it won't happen. And just as maybe 100, 150 years after Lord Chaitanya, his movement almost like vanished after tremendous success, history repeats itself. And so what we're looking at is the possible vanishing of ISKCON as a truly international movement for, your guess, 1 century, 2 centuries, God only knows. At the present time in ISKCON, this is like real world stuff, you know? If you can just kind of like crawl out of the exuberant ISKCON 50 bubble for a second and look at the real world, this is real world stuff. The clock is ticking for the simple reason that at the present time in ISKCON, the most senior spiritual leaders are Western devotees, you know, with few exceptions, because the movement started much sooner there than it did in India. And even though Prabhupada went back to India in 1970, he couldn't really young people couldn't join because India was still so conservative that, you know, respectable families wouldn't let their children join the Hare Krishna movement. And that gradually changed. But, so ISKCON didn't really begin to make significant numbers of devotees in India until probably the mid-80s or 1990. And so the movement started in 66 in America, and so India, in the sense of when they started to actually make devotees in a way analogous to the West, it was like maybe 25 years later. And so for that reason, historically, the vast majority of most senior spiritual leaders in ISKCON are Western. For those of you who are, you know, younger than me, I see a couple people younger than me. Within your lifetime, that will be gone forever. Within your lifetime, that situation where the most senior spiritual leaders are Western will end, and it will end forever. And so the real question is, what will preserve ISKCON as a truly international movement? How will Prabhupada's strategy be fulfilled? He put it in his pranam mantra, the mantra we chant to Prabhupada. Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. When I started Krishna West, some unusually brilliant people said, oh, West is mundane, why say Krishna West? Forgetting that Prabhupada used the word first in his own pranam mantra. And then they said that we got some other really ingenious objections, like, why don't you say Krishna North or South? The answer is maybe because there's no such thing as Northern culture. Maybe because there's no such thing as Southern culture. Is that a good reason? So, in a sense, it's us. We have to do this. We are in a crucial historical situation. And if we don't do this, you know, there could be very serious consequences, historically, for ISKCON. Irreparable consequences, at least irreparable for a good amount of time. As far as what we're doing, read my papers. You know, we can send them to you. And I think it's very clear. We've documented over and over and over again that everything we're doing in Krishna West comes right from Prabhupada. You know, we always say keep Prabhupada in the center. It's very important we not keep an ultra-conservative Prabhupada in the center, an ultra-conservative Prabhupada that ultra-conservative leaders have created in their own image. When we look at the real Prabhupada, and I've documented this, you know, don't take my word for it, I'm just a cult leader. Look at I mean, page after page of statements from Prabhupada, from the Bhagavatam, from his lectures, from here, from there. Prabhupada was obviously conservative in the right way, and he was extremely liberal. Because historically, the two great imperatives to make this movement work, or make any such movement work, is that you must perform two essential functions. We must preserve, and we must adapt. If you don't preserve the essence, the core, you just become something else. And if you don't adapt, you go extinct. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're a, you know, saber-toothed tiger or the Hare Krishna movement. If you don't adapt, you go extinct. That's just the way it is. And so, failing to preserve the essence is an existential threat, the current in way to say it. Failing to preserve ISKCON's essence is an existential threat to this movement. Failing to adapt is an existential threat to this movement. And it's a question of balance. So how do we know what the essence is? How do we know we got things in the right box? Well, there's a list. And it's in the 6th chapter of Nectar Devotion. And that's where Prabhupada introduces the idea that there are basic principles that you cannot change, like chant Hare Krishna, And there are details which you can change. And in fact, you must change to survive. You must adapt. The problem is that, well, I don't want to say some leaders, but okay, imagine I said something else that means the same thing. So many people in ISKCON have mixed up these two boxes. So that, for example, dressing like an Indian is as important as chanting the name of God. Or offering Turkish food to Krishna on the grounds that it's the only food Krishna likes because it's veg, is somehow as important as, I don't know, reading the Bhagavatam. It's funny because among the foods that are the only foods Krishna wants are all these sabjis, Indian sabjis with tomatoes and chili, potatoes, none of which existed in India during the time of Lord Chaitanya. They come from the Western Hemisphere. So, stuff that comes from the Western Hemisphere, indigenous peoples of the Americas, stuff that comes from Turkey and other Muslim countries, and somehow this becomes the eternal Vedic food that Krishna wants. Anyway, it's entertaining in its own way. So, maybe I'll stop here, and again, I'd like to thank all the wonderful devotees that are carrying forward this mission. Everything's on the line here. There are moments in history where one bad decision destroys an empire. I can give you many, many examples, whether it was forgetting to close off the water pipes in Constantinople, and after 1,000 years it fell to the Ottoman invaders, whether it was the generals of the Byzantine Empire choosing the wrong battlefield when the Muslims invaded, and even though they outnumbered the invaders, the whole empire collapsed. I mean, I go on and on and on. Whether it was there's just slight error. Whether it was Suleiman the Magnificent, Suleiman, who was the greatest of all Ottoman emperors, who actually conquered the Balkan countries, creating so much trouble for the next several centuries. And he wanted to conquer Europe, and he actually looked like he might do it. And he invaded Vienna. He marched to Vienna, where that was the capital of the Habsburg Empire. It was one of the great European empires, and no one could stop him. Not only that, he wasn't a savage. He was highly educated. He had super technology. He had, like, the bomb. The bomb in those days was the super next-gen cannon, the latest generation of cannon technology, which could blow down city walls. And if you have a cannon that blows down city walls, it's like being caught in the laboratory or something. I mean, you're finished. And so he assembled this huge army. He marched on Vienna, but there was one thing happened. He made one big mistake. And by the way, in the meantime, in Europe was in total panic. Europe was in total panic, and armies from Poland, from France, from everywhere were just rushing to Vienna to save Europe, to save Christianity, of course. And it rained too much. They got an unusual amount of rain that year on the road to Vienna. And Suleiman was already, come on, we've taken years to organize this, I'm not turning back now. He had to leave his big cannon at home. Couldn't bring his big cannon, the roads were too muddy. And he laid siege and he failed, and he returned, and that was it. That was the end of the Islam. And the other great Islamic invasion of Europe, by the way, was from the Moors, who conquered most of Spain, defeated the Visigoths. I won't go into all this, but so around 711, I always remember, the convenience store, 711, they entered Spain and they conquered most of Spain, almost all of Spain, and they marched on France. They were going to take over Europe, and they were finally defeated in the Battle of Tours, near the little village of Poitiers. Anyway, so like the right or wrong decision at critical times in history change history. History often pivots on a very small point, and with very few people involved. Mm-hmm. And so we have to do this for Prabhupada. That's Krishna West. So thank you all for your attention. And obviously I think this is by far the most important devotional service anyone can do right now, because I think literally the world depends on it. Yeah, bring out the prasadam. Any questions? Yes?
Just when you said there's no sort of north or south culture,
There's no what?
north or south culture. But then not that I think this way, some people, well, I heard the famous thing that I asked Gandhi, what do you think of Western civilization? He said, well, I think it'd be a good idea.
Yeah, I think Gandhi. Yeah, but that kind of Indian chauvinism is, I mean, we can go through the list of horrible things going on in India, the very high rate of child abuse, very high rate of abuse of women. But why do that? There's a lot of great people in India, there's a lot of great culture in India. Why bash India? So why bash the West? This West bashing is just, there are a lot of things in the West that are much more Vedic than in India. For example, if you read the Bhagavatam, if you read over and over again, all the sacred literature, it's a really big deal to have honest government, a government that actually takes care of the people. So, I mean, in terms of government services, do you want to be in India or Denmark? There are actually research institutes that study governmental transparency. Like, what are the most corrupt governments? What are the most transparent, honest governments that actually take care of the people? And almost all the most honest governments, well, they're in Northern Europe. And India's way near the bottom. So having like a pandemic level of corruption, and having huge numbers of people die and be subjected to injustice because of government corruption, that's the opposite. That's a Sura government. That's a Sura government. Demonic government. And so, some things in India are much better, obviously. People in India know Krishna, and some things in the West are much better. In fact, when Prabhupada first came to America, that's where he said that in America there are so many wonderful things, but there are zeros without Krishna. But don't forget your grammar school math. When you have a large number, Prabhupada said if you put the 1 of Krishna in front of these zeros, it becomes a big number. Zero was invented in India, and the whole digital age depends on that invention of zero. But the point is that, let's say you have the number 10,000, and you add 1 0 to the right of the 1. That 0 is worth 90,000. The next 0 is 900,000. The next 0 is 9 million, and on and on. So when Prabhupada said there are many good things in America, but zeros without Krishna, he meant these things have extraordinary intrinsic value, and all that is lacking is Krishna. I was with Prabhupada once. He flew into Los Angeles, and I received him at the airport, the other devotees. And it was a very foggy day. I mean, couldn't see anything. And Prabhupada was amazed that the plane landed in the fog. And so we were in this limousine. We were driving Prabhupada back to the temple. I was sitting next to Prabhupada, and so he said, how could the plane land in all that fog? So one devotee explained to Prabhupada about the radar. Prabhupada just laughed, and he said, in this material world, there's no happiness. But if there's a little happiness, it's in America. When Prabhupada, just before he passed away, his last attempt to go back to the West, and of course he only got as far as London, had to turn back because of his health. But the reason he went is because with tears in his eyes, he said that he was overwhelmed with feelings of gratitude toward what America had done for him. Not only did Americans join this movement, but that people gave donations, they bought his books, America defended Prabhupada against deprogrammers. They defended Prabhupada's legal rights. They gave him, and he was actually overwhelmed. He was in tears, just by his feelings of gratitude, remembering what America and other Western countries had given him. And so you cannot simultaneously attract a society and trash and denigrate them. You can't do both. So figure out which one you want to do. Do you want to denigrate and insult and offend the West, or do you want to attract it? Your choice. Because, West bashing is kind of a pastime in ISKCON, and the reason is obvious, because there's a whole field of social science called the psychology of oppressed peoples, or marginalized peoples. we sort of self-marginalize by our exotic presentation. And when people live in a society and feel they're marginalized or not respected, they develop a special psychology. One of the features, which is they tend to believe more in conspiracy theories. People that feel they're marginalized or not respected in society believe more in conspiracy theories. They tend to be skeptical even about legitimate science, even about objective facts. Everything is a conspiracy. You know, the media, everything, there's no objective information out there. You can't trust Western medicine. So that you get people who literally kill themselves. They die because they suffer from diseases that could have been cured, easily cured, but they have two religions. One religion is Krishna consciousness, the other religion is natural medicine. Two religions. And so it's really very simple. You know, you choose. Do you want to just constantly denigrate, insult, and offend the Western world, or do you want to save it and attract it? I mean, the denigration gets to the point where people are offended by, hey, what's your name?
Calypso.
What?
Calypso.
Well, thanks for coming. It's where people objected to Krishna West because it was offensive to even juxtapose the words Krishna and West. Because the West is such a vulgar, profane word. I actually like the West. I mean, I see Krishna here, but I can drink the water here. I mean, India's a great place. It's a beautiful country. There are innumerable great souls there. I know that. I mean, I have experienced personally, very clearly, how the spiritual world is in Vrindavan or Mayapur. Krishna has shown me that. Krishna has shown me the spiritual world there. So I understand what's going on there. But Prabhupada used to praise America. Prabhupada's strategy wasn't to denigrate and insult America or other Western countries. It was to praise it and sincerely praise it. You have such a great nation. Now accept this great philosophy. Once sitting in Prabhupada's garden, he looked at me and said, what is the use if you're being American, if you're being born American, if you don't do something wonderful? Prabhupada said the way you attract an important, proud person is you praise him. So, anyway, you know all these things. This is my stump speech. So, objectively speaking, for example, when I was preaching in South America, Prabhupada put me in charge in Latin America, I didn't think that my zone was more important than, let's say, the North European zone or the Midwest United States zone. I didn't think that my service was more important than the service of so many other devotees or leaders. I just thought, this is my service. Prabhupada asked me to do this. And so many times, I can go and give a talk somewhere, some other devotee can give a talk somewhere. I'm just doing but in this case, I think objectively, this is more important. Not because it's me, it's not about me. It's really not about me. It's about Prabhupada, it's about saving ISKCON. Saving the ISKCON that Prabhupada envisioned. So I think there's nothing more urgent than making Krishna West work. Yes?
I have a question. You mentioned about the importance about Prabhupada's books, but there are parts of Prabhupada's books, where he talks about things like the Varna ashram system, which is a very hierarchical society, which seems to be very much opposed or in contrast with today's Western values.
Yes.
So how does Krishna West translate these aspects of Prabhupada's teachings?
Okay. First of all, take the ashram. That's the system. That's the easy part. I would say it's just a question of decency. You know, it depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to exploit your body and to exploit other people's bodies, and you know, bestiality is cool and sexy, it's just like this incredibly vulgar way of talking nowadays, where they say someone, like some girl's hot or some guy's hot. It's like, what is it? Like I have a disciple, Leela Preach, she was so funny. She used to say, it's like school in the summertime, no class. So it's about respect. I mean, everyone is. I mean, for example, the amount of sexual abuse, sexual harassment, it's you know, it's an epidemic. They do studies that say, you know, like the percentage of, let's say, percentage of girls who say that during their university days they were sexually harassed or date rape or this or that. It's not a small number. And so the vulgarity, the narcissistic stupidity of the modern culture. And so therefore there is a real need for chastity. Chastity doesn't mean one gender subjugating another gender. It means that people respect themselves as spiritual beings. They don't try to exploit their own bodies or other people's bodies because we're spiritual beings. So that's the ashram. So basically the whole ashram system is really just a strategy to deal with human sexuality. Because you're a student, and so you study. I mean, I know if I would have gone to a boys' school in junior high and high school, I might have actually learned something. I mean, instead of just like staring at the girl. So, you know, I might have actually learned something. And studies show, for example, that girls who go to girls' schools are happier and learn a lot more. And so, that's the ashrams. You know, when you're young, just study and don't try to usurp the privileges of people who have made lifelong commitments to each other. Sexual intimacy is a privilege. It's a privilege for those who have made, who are seriously in love and who seriously commit to each other. That's the ashram system. And then you have the varna system. The varna system existed all around the world. The only difference, they talk about the Indian caste system, the difference between, say, India and Europe is just that Europe had an industrial revolution first. But, and also because Europeans, Europeans are more into individuality and individual rights. This goes back to the earliest recorded contacts between East and West. The earliest contacts that we have really documented are the great Greek and Persian wars. One of those was, they made a film called, what's it, 400 or 600 or
300?
300, yeah. Where the Spartans held off these massive Persian forces. So if you study the wars in detail, like what happened and how many people were on each side, just the military strategies that grew out of different cultures. Like, for example, in Persia, you had this like Eastern potentate who would just decide everything. The Greeks were much more individualistic. They could adjust better, and so what you find is consistently, much smaller numbers of Greeks could hold off and defeat vastly superior numbers of Persians because they had this individualism and they were tough. But anyway, that's a whole other subject. But and then with Alexander, so then the next, perhaps, after the Greek-Persian wars, you have this contact with Alexander, who actually conquers the Persian Empire, kind of like, payback for all the Persian invasions of Greece, and throughout history. So, I forget, what was your original question?
It seems that Prabhupada emphasized a lot on the importance of
the Varnas. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, the Varnas. Yeah. So the Varnas, they were, so Europe with all this individualism and kind of, anyway, I won't go into the whole history of why the Industrial Revolution occurred first in, the West and not the East, So because the Varna system, Chaturvarnyam, is based on an agrarian economy. It's based on an agricultural economy, not an industrial or post-industrial economy. And that's why when Prabhupada introduced this thing that we need to do Varnashram, he also emphasized we need to buy land and establish rural communities because they go together. So at the present time, because we live in a highly urbanized society, and so to recreate an agricultural economy, which is actually one of the foundations of the Varna system. I mean, to divide everyone into 4 groups, that's very simple. But it works in a simple agrarian society. So as far as you explain it to people, it makes perfect sense. I mean, who would you rather have making decisions? Wise people that renounce personal wealth or capitalists? I mean, we already know that the present leaders, I mean, the American government is for sale to the highest bidder. We know that. And we know that the wealth distribution is crazy. We know that the richest people don't pay taxes. And, America is degenerating into a plutocracy, which is ruled by the rich. And there's this sort of this extreme polarization of wealth. So, is that what you want? I mean, isn't it kind of a good idea to have the people who have the ultimate authority, even to instruct kings, personally cannot be wealthy? Personally, you can't bribe them because they can't accept anything. They must live simply. They must live austerely. So what are you going to offer them? So in a sense, if you have Brahmins who actually are true Brahmins, how do you corrupt them? What do you offer them? That makes perfect sense. And then having leaders, say rulers, who are very cautious about war because they have to go first. If there was a rule that, say, American presidents, if they declare war, they have to be in the front line, you might have less wars. And then you have a productive, obviously, and then you have the people who actually produce wealth, the Vaishyas. That's their job, to produce wealth. They have 2 other layers above them. Because we know that, I mean, we've seen America and all over the world, these capitalists, these rich people, they're like, oh my God. I mean, who trusts them? They're amoral. They're just amoral. And so the idea that you have 2 higher layers, 2 layers above them to prevent them from just, turning the whole world into a commercial product, including religion, including everything else, including everything is just a commercial product. So you have these 2 layers above them, and then you have the workers who are taken care of, who are happy, but who, I mean, if you look at our culture, people who are really Shudras, who make music music which is violently, disgustingly misogynistic, but they're stars, they're rap stars, and if you, because what happens in a capitalist society is that the more you sell of your entertainment product, whether it's music or movie, the more important you are, and you get the social pyramid where the number of people who are truly wise is not a huge number, and then it kind of goes down from there. And then at the base of the pyramid, you have a lot of people who are, like we saw in this last election, where you get huge numbers of people who really could not care less whether some statement is true or not. They really don't care. And so, again, if we explain these things scientifically, hey, thanks for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Hey, see you later.
I hope so. It was wonderful to hear from you. Good night.
So again, it's a question of explaining it. If we explain things intelligently, people will appreciate it. So it's getting a little late. Anything else? Weather, sports, traffic?
Jokes.
I got a question, Maharaj.
Yeah.
You quoted how Prabhupada said that if you're an American, it's considered the greatest country, so you should do a great thing. Right. So everyone's an individual, and I think throughout even our society's history, individuality is also there, and so there's always exceptions to the rule.
Of course.
Is the problem. And so are situations where people aren't abused and there wasn't a disrespect, but there's also maybe the general mass may have been the other way. But what I'm getting at is in preaching Krishna consciousness or Krishna West, because the individual has a different potency, a different ability, charisma, different things. So we want to do a great thing, but some people can't do a big thing. So I think it's always important that people understand that they can, just whatever you do in the right mood, even if you influence a few people, that's a big deal.
That's a very good point. I mean, you're certainly right. I would only add that there is strength in numbers. You know, in unity there's strength. And so I would say, if more important than, let's say, I do this much or that much, as you said, we have the story of Hanuman and the spider and all that. And so at the same time, if you get a bunch of people, maybe not doing gigantic things, but doing their best, but if those people are working together, if they're united, then it becomes powerful. Otherwise, there's a type of, what's that word? Energy becomes dispersed. So like in many little places, someone does a little here, little there, and it doesn't add up to anything. Whereas if we work together, teamwork, the way I put it is Sankirtan's a team sport. If we work together, if we have a common cause, if there's a conscious alliance and people are encouraging each other, then all those, you would say humble services, but very sincere services, they really start to have a powerful effect. Ananda?
I think that one of the things that in the movement we haven't looked that much at yet is synergy of natures, not just for an ashram in terms of like the static, but the dynamic interaction between. And so if we want something to happen, we look at what a person needs in order to make that thing happen, and who's needed to support it, and what the different pieces are to create an engine. Because even with the battery, there's a positive and a negative pole, and then there's the neutral in the middle. And just really
Hey, I didn't know that.
cultivating.
You know more about engines than I do.
Well, I don't know much. Just cultivating that understanding of the mechanics or the engineering of creating a functional culture that's rising together.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. That really is intelligent leadership, where you respect people and understand how they work together. Absolutely. Anyway, thank you all very much. I appreciate your time, and sorry if I just couldn't stop, but yeah, I really appreciate you all coming, and I hope we can all work together. We really need to rebuild the Western Hare Krishna movement. That's the real point. Because there has to be a movement that people want to join, that people feel comfortable joining, that we feel comfortable being in. And, that's just what history teaches us, and that's what Prabhupada knew, and that's what this guru knew. That we have to have an alliance, we have to work together, there has to be, with all the, how should I put it, the inevitable silliness that comes with institutions, Bhaktisiddhanta says it's a necessary evil. And I know probably most of us, including myself, are very fond of our freedom and just, being able to have our own life. And so it is, I know when I knew in my heart that Krishna wanted me to do this whole Krishna West thing, I kind of was trying to negotiate with Krishna. Because I was really happy just having my own life and not being involved, not being a leader in a religious institution, just being able to chant Hare Krishna and then try to write books or whatever. And I didn't want to have to go out there and have arguments with people. And believe it or not, actually many times I prayed to Krishna and Prabhupada like, you don't really want me to go out and do all this, do you? It's a test, right? And I passed the test, I said I would do it, so now you can tell me that you don't really want me to do this. And so, but, no, I'm serious. And so I had to go out and travel to so many different countries, and so many debates, and write papers, and this and that. And actually my main motivation was that if I don't do this, how will I face Prabhupada? You know, Prabhupada trusted me so much, and how would I, like when I leave this world, how will I face Prabhupada? How can I tell him that I saw what was actually most dear to you, your Western mission? I saw it collapse. And I believed that I knew what the problem was, but I just didn't want to take the trouble to try to fix it. And I thought, how will I face him? How will I face Prabhupada? After he trusted me so much. And so that's why I'm here. I can honestly say that in terms of, you know, maybe people, everyone has some little or big extent desire to be a big person or, you know, famous. I mean, when I was very young, at the age of 29, I became one of the Fab 11. And, you know, I got to be an ISKCON Beatle, and so, you know, I've done all that. I've been chairman of the GBC, I've built up big zones, I've been a, you know, big guru, blah, 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 and I've done all that. And at this point in my life, really, those are, well, you're not my age, well enough. You're kind of approaching my generation. And you know very well, when you get to a certain age, all you want to do is leave me alone, let me live in peace, and just, you know, chant Hare Krishna. And so, and even Prabhupada, you know, when Prabhupada came to the West, he used to always say, at that age, no one wants to leave home. Prabhupada used to say, he would laugh and he'd say that my Guru Maharaj dragged me out. Because he kept getting these dreams where his Guru was ordering him, take sannyas, go out and preach. And he was, you know, Prabhupada was, you know, at an age when, it's really true, at a certain age, you just don't want trouble, you just want to live in peace. And his Guru, he'd probably used to say that my Guru, you know, forced me, dragged me out of my family life. And so, I know that Prabhupada also pulled me up of my peaceful life, and so it gets down to that. I mean, the early days of ISKCON, there were sort of exaggerated extreme levels of self-sacrifice and self-abnegation, which were not healthy. And people, you know, nature will always balance itself, the pendulum effect. So as extreme as we were in self-sacrifice, it went that far to self-indulgence. I mean, because it's just, that's how you balance yourself. And so many devotees who were just, you know, nothing but the mission became nothing but my human stability and happiness. And I'm not criticizing that. I think even sannyasis, I think everyone who was there back then in their own way balanced themselves and had to give attention to their own human life. But there comes a time when we have to get out there again. Society's become tired. Again, I study history a lot. And you see cases where, like society just can't defend itself anymore, or won't defend itself. You see that in the Western Roman Empire. And you start to see these Germanic incursions into Italy, and, you know, what the historians ask is, where was the army? You know, where was the army? To some extent, the Germans were the army. That's a whole other story, but they were already integrated into the Roman military. But you see this all the time. I mean, civilizations have a shelf life. And you see, I mean, you look at the Islamic conquest when they were just like beating everybody, and then it's just kind of at a certain point, kind of ran out of gas. They started losing a lot, and they just didn't have the will. It's just, you know, that will was gone. The Mongol obliteration of Baghdad didn't help in the 1200s. But anyway, so civilizations, movements, just sometimes get tired, or they just get tired of it. And they just stop fighting. They just stop fighting, and just personal accommodation, personal comfort becomes the goal of life in Krishna consciousness. And what is really required of all of us is that I'm not suggesting we go back to the irrational extremes of the past. We're not going back to just irrational, unhealthy levels of self-sacrifice. That's what I'm talking about. I see it as a dialectic movement. It's going forward, you know, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The sin, by the way, in synthesis is Sanskrit. It's Sanskrit sang, like Sankirtan. Greek sin, same thing together. But anyway, the thesis is, so the thesis is the original status quo, which early ISKCON, everyone, fanatically self-sacrificing, the mission is everything. If you actually seriously care about your physical or mental health, that's sense gratification. If you care about your intellectual health, that's like you really are in Maya. And so, because we were young, I call it Vedic Lord of the Flies. And so, it's a bunch of young people acting like they're elders and not quite getting it right. So obviously there's a reaction, pendulum effect, where people like enthusiasm or let's go out and preach. It's like, come on, will you please be civilized? It's interesting because after the English Civil War of 1640, which actually went on a lot longer, it was so bad, so violent, that after that in England, one of the worst words, like a word you wouldn't use, was enthusiasm. But anyway, so it went to the antithesis, because every thesis, status quo generates its opposite. It's interesting because if the status quo is moderate, it generates a moderate opposition. It's the pendulum. So if you just pull the pendulum maybe like 5 degrees, it'll just go 5 degrees the other way, it kind of stays in the center. And it's very stable. When you pull it all the way this way, it goes all the way to the other extreme. I mean, this is true in terms of human psychology, in terms of political systems. There's a pendulum effect. Like Plato said, tyranny breeds anarchy. Anyway, but now, what do we do now? We've had the ISKCON thesis, which was kind of like this, probably fanatical in the sense that, the philosophy was correct, but just sort of extreme, fanatical self-sacrifice. And then we went to the other extreme, where basically you just take care of yourself and be happy and chant Hare Krishna when you feel good about it. And I'm saying the synthesis moving forward is, let's revive the enthusiasm, determination, and compassion of the past, but let's also be mature adults. And keep ourselves physically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually healthy. So what we need now is a mature enthusiasm. If the first stage was immature enthusiasm, the next stage is mature dullness. And the next stage, historically, is mature enthusiasm. And the mission is to save the West, because frankly, if one more Western devotee goes to India to do some service here or there, it's nice, and ultimately that's what they want to do, so be it. It's not gonna help Prabhupada very much. They may be pleasing themselves spiritually or materially. Basically, we need to get some discipline back in this, where people just stop pleasing themselves in Krishna consciousness and start thinking about what Prabhupada needs. Because there's not a whole lot of that going on, frankly. And that's the message. That's Krishna West.
Amen, brother.
Right on, brother. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate your coming, and let's do this. Hare Krishna. Hey, Radha. Radha Rani.